Namaste and welcome to the sidelines of the Pondy Lit Fest 2023. It is my great pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. Ankur Kakkar and Professor Sreejit Datta. Welcome to Pondy. How does it feel to be here?
Namaste. Thank you for hosting us and for having us here in this wonderful city of Pondicherry. We are honored to be in the city of Sri Aurobindo, and it feels great, and we are really enjoying the sessions that are going on here. So thank you.
Namaste, Priyanka. Thanks for having me, and namaskar to all the audiences of the Pondy Lit Fest. It's fantastic to be here amid such exciting conversations. We have been having a lot of food for thought for the past 1.5 days. So I'm very excited to see what it has to unfold for the last few sessions today and tomorrow, and also in the coming years. So
wonderful. We'll talk more about your work, but could you quickly tell our viewers a little bit about yourselves?
Sure. Namaste. My name is Dr. Ankur Kakkar. I am a historian and I am an associate professor at Indus University in Ahmedabad. My work has been on the history of education in India. My PhD was supervised by the daughter of Dharampal ji. Dharampal, as you know, was an eminent historian. He wrote the famous work, The Beautiful Tree, published in 1983. So my work is following in the footsteps of Dharampal ji's work, and I have looked at the history of education in India from the traditional perspective. So I'm looking at the traditional systems of education, such as the various kinds of gurukuls, pathshalas, ashrams that have flourished in India in the last 100 and 200 years. Thank you.
Namaste, my name is Sreejit Datta. I am a student of philosophy, and I also teach aesthetics at UID, Karnavati University in Gandhinagar, Gujarat. Currently, I am working on a book on the subject of revolutionary nationalism, mainly focused in Bengal, but taking a larger view of the cultural and the religious sources of inspiration that went behind the creation of this historical phenomenon. So I hope we'll be talking about that in our conversation today.
Definitely. And I want to capitalize as much as possible on your fields of expertise. So there are two aspects that I'd like us to talk about. One is the history of education in the past in Bharat, and the other is the education of history in the future of Bharat. So, Dr. Kakkar, we loosely translate, I will say loosely, history as itihasa, but they are not quite the same. Could you tell us what the essential difference is?
Right. I'm glad you raised this question because it's very important to distinguish between history and itihasa. When we talk about history, we talk about the discipline of objectively finding out historical facts from the past. So the discipline of history emerged in the 18th century after the Enlightenment. One of the founders was Leopold von Ranke, one of the propounders of positivism, and he laid stress on the evidence-based history, so empiricism-based history, that you should know the truth as it is, as the things actually happened. So that was the beginnings of this discipline of history as it emerged in the West. Of course, there were other strands also that later on came after Ranke. For example, E.H. Carr was talking about the subjective approach also. And then Fernand Braudel talks about the larger forces and the not just event-based history. But broadly, as a discipline in the West, how it has emerged, history has focused on empirical data. And the focus even today, when anybody writes a historical book, is based on primary sources. So you have to have primary sources. You have to lay stress on how things actually happen. This is what history is basically about. When we talk about itihas is not just the objective representation of a historical past. Because in itihas, we are not so much concerned about the things as they actually happened, but about what they represent. So it's like history operates at the Adi Bhautik level. So there are three levels in the Indian tradition, which we see reality at three levels: the Adi Bhautik level, which is the material level, the Adi Devik level, which is the subjective or the divine level, and the Adhyatmik level, which is the spiritual level. History operates at the material level because it is concerned with the objective facts. Okay, what thing happened at what place at what time? That is the concern of history as a discipline. The concern of itihas is more subjective and ultimately it is spiritual. It leads to spirituality. So that's why the itihas are concerned with the four purusharths of life, which is dharma, arth, kam, and moksha. So, okay. So in India, itihas is not just about the objective representation of reality. It is about what reality means. So it is actually, itihas is a journey of consciousness. In itihas, consciousness is primary. In history, objective reality is primary. There is a difference between the two. So they operate at different levels. That doesn't mean that itihas is denying objectivity or that itihas is denying any objective or material or any kind of matter-based reality. It is, you can say, it transcends that level. Okay, so itihas goes beyond the material level. It includes the material also, but it goes beyond the material level. That's why itihas for us is darshan and darpan. Darshan means it is, we are seeing philosophy in that. That is how we see what it means. As I said, dharma, arth, kam, and moksha are the principles of itihas. And darpan because it is a journey of us. For example, when we read the Ramayana, we are seeing our story also in it. So it is a journey. It is supposed to be a journey of our consciousness. So the purpose of itihas is ultimately to transform your consciousness. So that is the fundamental difference between itihas and history.
Thank you for that very lucid and beautiful explanation. So Sreejit, we can look at history as the story of time itself. So what is the Indic perception of this notion of time?
Thank you. I think that's a very good point to discuss when we are taking a comparative approach to history and itihasa, and for which Dr. Kakkar's explanation will be very useful, I'm sure. The conception of time is fundamental to the understanding of history as a source of knowledge, or as epistemology, as we call it in philosophy. And how we look at time also shapes our perception about how we validate the knowledge about time, knowledge that is placed or located within temporal dimensions. So in India, there are two very specific disciplines, I would call them, two Vedangas, which are intimately related to our conception of time. And these are the Jyotisha and Kalpa, these two Vedangas. As you might know, that Vedanga is like, there are 6 Vedangas, and all of these 6 are supposed to be compulsory subjects that you must acquire knowledge of in order to make a foray into the study of the Vedas. To understand the Vedas, you have to understand or have a very thorough knowledge of the 6 Vedangas. Jyotisha tells us about the time and how to calculate time, how to conceive and calculate time, and how to demarcate the various anushtanas, the karma kanda of the Vedas, which are basically the different kinds of sacrifices or yajnas and vratas, and to situate each of these performances or anushtana of the yajnas and the vratas, we need to know meticulously at which point in time they need to be performed. So for that, there are prescriptions and there are calculations that can be mastered in order to, first of all, divide time into various categories, such as the ahoratra or day and night, and then there is the paksha or the fortnight, the masa or the month, and then there is a very important concept of ritu, which is the cycle of seasons, which is why one way of understanding the meaning of the performer of the yajna, ritvik, is ritu yaji, somebody who performs the yajnas as per the changing cycles of the season. So these categorizations of time and these demarcations of time basically is central to the performance of the yajnas, which is at the center of the Vedic worldview. So from there, our conception of time comes, and we have this very fundamental notion about the repetitive cycles of time, which again comes back to the changing seasons and the ayana or the movement of the the solar year and the movement of the sun itself, because we divide the year into two halves as Dakshinayana and Uttarayana. So these concepts and these changing cycles of the day and night, of the ritus, of the seasons and the year itself, has given birth to the cyclical conception of time, where it is no longer seen as a linear journey through time, that there is one fixed beginning and there is one end, and there's nothing beyond, nothing before the origin of time, as well as nothing beyond, the end of time, which is sort of fundamental in the Judeo-Christian worldview, I would say. So cyclical progression of time and understanding time for the very intricate categorization and calculation of time for performance of the central aspect of Vedic worldview, which is yajna. These have been, very important in gaining the conception of time in our culture.
Okay, so now that we have established what we mean by these terms, you spoke also of the very entrenched link with nature, how it was intricately linked.
Absolutely.
That everything went by the ritus. So was this aspect of nature, was it included when education was imparted in the ancient times?
Yes, of course. In fact, I would like to elaborate more on this thing that Sreejit was talking about. When we see time not as a linear phenomena, but as a cyclical phenomena, then our worldview completely changes. Because if we see time as a linear phenomena, then there is a tendency to see that, okay, one thing has progressed from A to B and to C. So then you have this whole discourse of, development and progress and forward movement, and then the whole dialectical materialism of Hegel and Marx and all that. So that is why in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Western philosophers, they saw European civilization as an advanced civilization as compared to Indian civilization, which they saw as a backward or inferior, because of this conception of time. They visualize time as linear and as civilization moving from a stage A to a stage B and to a stage C, and advancing in that sense.
But it was actually their lens that was myopic.
Yeah,
they were only looking at one segment.
So so when you look at this from the Indian framework, then the cyclical conception of time changes your whole worldview. Then there is no concept of what is forward and what is backward, because in a cyclical view you can't have any forward. There is no, even in a geometrical sense, there is no forward and backward, and there is no progress in that sense,
or beginning
or
end.
end. Exactly, a beginning or end. And this is why in the Indian framework also, like when in the education system, as you were saying, when we were taught this framework, so this whole conception of karma also comes into the picture.
Right.
Because so if you have this whole cyclical time, and even this the concept of karma and reincarnation, that gets included in the system of the framework that is taught in the Indian education system. So coming to your question of seasons in particular, they influenced, yes, the ways, the different times at which educational sessions were conducted. For example, in the rainy seasons, there was generally a gap in certain areas, especially, which was reserved for then meditation and for rest for some scholars. So seasons did influence the way we conducted our education system and the way the whole system was conducted. Yeah.
And more generally, what did it look like? And I'm going to ask you how much it's changed by
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
So in that context, education generally, but also itihasa, we're not going to use the word history anymore because itihasa is much more appropriate. How was it taught, or how was it imparted? I'd prefer to use that word.
That's a good question. Because generally when we talk about ancient Indian education or traditional Indian education, we tend to think that it was only limited to the Vedas and or maybe Upanishads at that time. Okay. But as recently as the 19th century, we find evidence from the various surveys that were conducted at that time that in traditional Indian pathshalas, the itihasas and the Purans were very much part of the education system. So all these texts that, of course, the Ramayana, Mahabharata and Bhagavad Puran, these three were the most commonly read texts. This is mentioned in all these surveys. Excerpts and chapters were read from these texts. But not just from these texts. These were the main and most important ones, which were common throughout all of India, from north to south. But other than that, there were local tales that were adaptations of these texts in the local variations. They would take, for example, a chapter from the Mahabharata, like in Bengal, there was a chapter like, let's say, Datta Karna, then about the virtues of Karna. Then there was a chapter on Devi. Okay, so there were chapters from the itihasas, but then adapted in the local tales, how they were taught. So these were important part of the education system because they fulfilled a central purpose, which was both moral and cultural. So basically, when the child enters the pathshala, he is taught not only the subjects that he is supposed to read, like for basic reading, writing, arithmetic, and accounts that is going to be useful for his practical occupation, but also he is taught these itihasas and Purans, which then go into shaping the whole moral and the character of the person.
Right.
So then these values actually are taught through these epics and through these itihasas. So that is why they played a central role, because you see that the values of the education system were that the person had to know his dharma, I would say, in three different ways. He had to know what is his social dharma, and the society, political dharma. He has to know. He has to know his individual dharma also. Okay, so dharma. So basically, this dharma is very subtle, and it is only through the itihasas that you can understand dharma. As I was telling you in the previous answer, that the purpose of itihasa was dharma, artha, kam, and moksha. So interestingly, you see, the itihasas are education in themselves, and they're also a form of entertainment, because then you have other rasas also in the itihas. So that is the reason they were included in the education system. Thank you.
And when you say chapters from itihasa, it suggests that there was a certain curriculum or a certain set of topics or subjects that had to be followed.
Yes.
Was there one?
Yes. So there were definitely some texts that were prescribed, not by some central agency.
Right.
It was organic, and there was a lot of variation depending on which part of India you were studying and which region and which locality. So, and also depending on your community. So, for example, the people from the trading community, they would, let's say people from the people who are the craftsmen, okay, they will read Vishwakarma Puran, which is one particular text, okay. Then people who are from some other community, they will read other texts. So then this education system was based on your particular community and on the area that you were in, okay. And it was prescribed not by some central agency, but by the tradition itself, okay, the tradition that they were following, because the purpose was to follow the tradition. That's why this principle was of each according to his own. There was not a concept of universal education in the sense that we understand it today, that everybody reads the same kind of text and the same kind of syllabus and the same kind of exam they have to appear. Okay. In the traditional Indian system, there was a system of specific texts being read, but then it was according to the tradition that they were studying. And of course, these texts are available to us and they are mentioned in the accounts that which texts are read in the Pathshalas. So there was a proper system of teaching, and most of these texts are still available to us. Some of them were taught orally, and some of them were taught in writing. So it is not that all the texts were taught as in a textbook form. Like you don't have all the textbooks as such of that period. But then these texts were, in many cases, were orally transmitted. So there was a tradition of the Katha parampara, which is a very important part of the education system, the traditional education system. Yeah, thank you.
So it sounds like it was in many ways an ideal education, because there's the emphasis, it's really adapted to the individual.
Yeah.
There's an awareness of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and there is making it alive with Katha.
Yes. Yes.
What happened? Where you say the texts are still available,
yes,
but they don't form the current history curriculum.
Yeah. So how did it how did we come to this situation?
How did we come to this, and what is this situation now?
Okay, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, it's a very valid question, because why are these texts not taught in our education system now? See, one of the fundamental reasons and one of the main interventions that was made by the British colonial education system was there was this principle of religious neutrality. They introduced this principle in the education system when the British introduced their education system. So they said that any text having anything to do with any religion will not be any part of education system. Okay, this was part of the laws that they instituted. Now, what happened as a result was that all the texts of the Indian tradition were outlawed from the curriculum, because in almost every text there is something that has to do with religion. Okay, not that, because see, in Indian tradition there is no separation between secular and religious sphere. Everything is combined in the same text. So even if you have to read, let's say, Shilpa Shastra, so Shilpa Shastra will be, suppose, Narad Shilpa Shastra. Then in that, to start with how Naradji questioned, got this, starts with the question answer, and then so it has a divine origin that you cannot separate from the text. So in the Indian context, there was no separation between the secular and the religious sphere. So actually, our education system was not religious education, and it was not secular education also. But when the British came, they had a different worldview, because they came from a different worldview, and for them, secular education means you have to separate religion from the public sphere. You know how the church and religion have to be separate. So everything that was public means, if you are teaching in a public institution, if a government school is being is teaching its curriculum, or government college, in that public institution you cannot have anything to do with religion, because that goes against the principle of secular education according to the secular worldview. This was instituted in Europe, because obviously that background was there, that this whole conflict between church and state, because in Europe the church controlled education, then the state controlled education. So then that's why they introduced this secular education. Secular means only state will be controlling the education, and religion or church will have nothing to do with the education system. When this same principle was implemented in India, then this result happened that all the texts were banned, because once you start banning religious texts, then you will find that in every text there is something to do with religion. So that is why all the texts were banned from the school curriculum. Now, problem is this, that even in the Indian laws, you have this principle of religious neutrality, and also even today you cannot, by law, if you are teaching in a government college, or even it is governed by government rules, if you are getting grants or it is following government rules in any manner, there is no way you can teach religious text. Even you can't teach anything, even Hanuman Chalisa you cannot read by law in a school. Now, this is completely opposite to the principles, because as I said, in the Pathshalas in Bengal, let's say, they started with Saraswati Vandana. Okay, they were teaching, then they start Guru Vandana. Okay, which was the basic way to start with. Even the child who was beginning to read alphabet, he would draw Ganesh on sand. Now that also becomes religious in if you look at it from a secular point of view. Okay, so from this point of view, when the British came, from their worldview, almost every aspect of the Indian education system was religious, and that's why the whole system had to be changed. So we came from that situation to this situation now, where we have to now talk about reviving our systems. And the irony is that today in India, except Hindu schools, other religions, they can teach their instruction in their schools. So if you are running a madrasa or you're running a missionary school, then you are free by law. You are free to teach Quran or Bible, Old Testament or New Testament in the school. Then there is no, by law, there is no provision to stop you. But this is just does not apply to the Hindu institutions, because Hindu institutions will come under the public domain, and in public domain it has to be secular. But then if you are conducting a madrasa or church, missionary school, that will come under the Minority Act, Religious Minority Act. So there, this secular thing will not apply. So you see this very clever ploy. When the British came, then they were introducing their own Christian education in a very subtle way in the education system. They were saying it is secular, but actually it was not secular.
Yes.
They were doing it in a very subtle way, and now they are doing it in a different way. So anyway, our education system is not, you can say our education system since the 19th century has been Christian education system.
Yes.
So that is the...
And now we're stuck with this
Yes.
irony and hypocrisy, even,
Yes.
of a very obsolete law.
Yes.
In between our ancient times and present times, there was a very articulate attempt to counter this British policy with national education. Sri Aurobindo, Rabindranath Tagore and others have spoken about it. And it was not only an attempt, it was alive in Bengal. The movement was alive. So what did it look like at the time?
Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you raised this question of national education, Priyanka, because I would like to take some time to give you a background of this. So with the entry of the European colonialists in India, and especially with the British, we have seen at the very beginning of the British Raj, the Company Raj, I should say, the East India Company was not, it actually took the policy of not interfering with the religious as well as educational practices as they happened in India. So we see that the early administrators of the East India Company, British East India Company, were more or less supportive of the way education and other religious activities were conducted in India. So we also see that they took a keen interest, the officials and the administrators of the company took a keen interest in Indian knowledge systems, as well as the Perso-Arabic knowledge systems, because we had madrasas and maktabs that used to teach Perso-Arabic knowledge systems. And as such, there were institutionalized attempts supported by the East India Company officials. Sometimes from the officials would personally support these institutions. They will give some donations to set up institutions in places like Banaras, in places like Calcutta. In Calcutta, actually, a Sanskrit college was set up by the government itself. So initially, there was a lot of support in favor of the Indian knowledge systems, and education and religion was more or less left untouched and uninterfered. This started to change from the first 2 decades of the 19th century, around 1810s, 1815. By 1815, we see a concerted effort in the British Parliament by the evangelicals who wanted to bring in, they were lobbying very hard to introduce Christian theological ideas in education, and they were also pushing hard to have English system of education and the English institutions such as schools and colleges and universities established in Indian cities and Indian provinces under the British control. And very, paradoxically, we see around the same time a similar kind of effort coming from native Indians. We see this especially in the three British provinces of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. In Bengal in particular, if we look at the kind of wonderful work that R.C. Majumdar has offered, he has delineated this entire history of education in India in the 19th century. And there he talks about how the Bengali upper class, and by class here I mean especially people who had some money, who had made some fortune through their business and other endeavors, their practices, often in collaboration with the British, the British merchants, as well as with the company itself. So these people would come together and they would transcend the barriers of caste even in order to set up institutions where English will be, one of the languages that will be taught, as well as the liberal arts of the humanities approach will be taken up, which is a very Western or European model of imparting education. So there was a lot of demand for this sort of education and learning English, in parallel.
So just a quick question. You said English is one of the languages.
Yes.
From the Indians, the request was to include it as one of the languages.
Yes.
But from the evangelicals, were they wanting it to be the primary language of instruction?
That's right.
Okay.
So from the evangelical point of view, their agenda was to push the cause of Christian religion, and they would want to, imbue Christian values in the Indian students, and through that they would forward the goal of the mission of the missionaries, that is to get as many converts as possible. But for these native Indians, they had a completely different agenda. They could see that the economic and political situation of India as well as the world outside, they were actually getting fair bit of information through newspapers and such things, books. The printing press had recently been introduced in India, and lots and lots of books and publications were carrying the news of outside world, especially of Europe and North America. So they could understand intuitively and through their interactions with the British and other Europeans that it has become a sort of unavoidable fact that the knowledge of English and the new systems of knowledge that are coming out from Europe, mainly with a focus on science, have to be imparted as part of education in Indian institutions to Indian students. And therefore, they would come together. They actually, set up schools and colleges. By 1815, there were several such schools in Calcutta. And on the year 1817, we see the famous Hindu college being set up. Often people say that, it was mainly through the effort of Ram Mohan Roy, but that's not very correct. Actually, people who were opposing Ram Mohan Roy, for religious and social reasons, they were behind this concerted effort, the concerted effort of the native Indians to set up the Hindu college, which institution played a singular role in spreading English education through the medium of the English language, as well as through the liberal arts approach, with different kinds of disciplines, including science, mathematics, geometry, geography, history, and so on and so forth. So that is one aspect of, our heritage in terms of how we received European education, and also with that, the European idea of history. Okay. But by the time it was the close of the 19th century, the fin de siècle, the end of the century, we see a generation of such English educated people intellectuals, writers, thinkers coming up in the form of people like Sri Aurobindo and Satish Chandra Mukhopadhyay, Rabindranath Tagore. These people were realizing that the national spirit is sorely missing from this kind of education that we are receiving at the English schools as well as colleges and universities. And therefore, they felt the need to create something that they described as national education. And there was a lot of debate about it, not just, between the European or rather the British administrators and the native Indians, but among the native Indians themselves. So within the National Congress, we get to see this sort of a debate between Gokhale on one side and Sri Aurobindo and others from Bengal on the other. And while, Sri Aurobindo, Satish Chandra Mukhopadhyay, his Dawn Society, which played a very, very important role in, first of all, introducing the notion of national education and then setting up very important institutions of imparting national education, one of which was the National College, which later transformed into the present-day Jadavpur University. So there were a lot of confusions at the very beginning of, or rather the inception of national education. And this time would be around 1905, 1907, 8. So the time of the Swadeshi movement. Okay. And we get to see that, especially with Sri Aurobindo, he has a lot many written accounts of that period of time, his own role as the principal of the National College. And he had a lot of things to say about how to conceive national education, how to impart national education. We see that he is constantly talking about something called the national spirit. And the nation, he conceives the idea of nation as something that is not merely a geographical region that has a shared memory among its people and a shared heritage. And that shared heritage and the shared memories constitute this national spirit, which should be the primary vehicle of education and, most importantly, historical education. This particular notion about national spirit, imbuing our conception of history and education is again found in Rabindranath Tagore's works. In Bharatbarsher Itihash, a particular essay written by Tagore around the same time, 1904, he talks about a new kind of teacher who would be the emblem of this national education. So they would embody the spirit of the nation, the national spirit, which Sri Aurobindo was talking about, and they would offer education in a spirit of service. So we get to see an example of this in the legendary professor and scholar of sociology, Professor Binoy Kumar Sarkar, who was a formidable student, and he had offers to teach in various universities in India, as well as there were offers from for higher study abroad. But he rejected all of that, and without taking any salary, he enlisted himself as a shebok, or a servant, one would say, at the National College, where he was teaching the humanities with a focus on history and also the social sciences, sociology, psychology, and so on and so forth. So a new idea of education was going hand in hand with the new idea of teaching, or the teacher who would impart that sort of education. So that was the spirit behind national education.
Right. And yet, more than a century later, we still haven't embodied that national spirit, and we still don't have a national education. But the two of you and some other wonderful scholars are doing some very important work in this domain. So I'd like to move to looking into the future now. And before that, I'd like both of you to tell us about the work you're doing right now, which I believe is going to be published soon and available to us. So could you tell us?
Sure. So currently I'm working, I've just finished my manuscript on the history of Gurukuls and Pathshalas in India in the last 100 to 100 years. So generally the history of education and the narrative that is taught to us is that in the last 200 years, when we look at the history of education or in general, we say that so many schools and colleges were established and so many, institutions were set up by the British, especially. And the whole discourse on education is basically this modern discourse. When you count number of colleges, number of students, literacy, and we look at this one model of education and its expansion throughout India. But what we don't know, or what is little known, is that in the last 100 and 200 years, there was existing a parallel system of education which has largely gone unnoticed. And this is what I have covered in my book. So I've looked at the pathshalas and the various kinds of pathshalas and gurukuls across all disciplines. So I've looked at Ved pathshalas, I've looked at pathshalas for drama, I've looked at pathshalas for Sanskrit, I've looked at the elementary pathshalas. Okay. And what I have found is that we were missing the elephant in the room. Yes, it was the elephant in the room because this system was actually training such a vast section of Indian society, and this was a traditional system of education, whereas we have completely missed this in our narrative of education. When we talk about the history of education, you take up any book that talks about the education history in the last 100 to 200 years, whether it is any standard book, no book will tell you that this was our education system or this was part of the education system. Almost every history of our education in the last 100 to 200 years is about the growth and expansion of the colonial institutions. Now we can call them modern institutions, number of schools, colleges set up by so and so and so. Okay. What I have covered in my book is the number of pathshalas and the kind of teaching and the diverse ways of knowing that were the modes through which they were taught in these different disciplines, and the vast sections of society who were performing different functions, how they were being trained. Of course, in many cases, this system was informal because it was not recognized by the formal modern system of education. Nevertheless, it was a systematic education system, even though it may not be taught in some building or in some school or college, but it was following a very specific, systematic, codified set of instruction principles. So, in India, there has been a traditional education system going on even in the last 200 years, even as it has gone largely unnoticed. So, my work is basically on this traditional system of education in India.
And I'm going to ask you what we can pick up from there and implement.
Yeah.
But before that, Sreejit, please tell us what you've been working on.
Right. So over the last 1 year, or little more than 1 year, I have been trying to write a book collecting the stories, mostly unknown and untold stories, especially in the English language and for the English audience, of our revolutionary nationalists, especially from Bengal, focusing on the period from 1905 to 1945. This is actually, this book writing came about because I was given a book writing fellowship by the Motwani Jadeja Foundation. It's called the Rajiv Circle Scholars Fellowship, named after the late Professor Rajiv Motwani. So, as part of this book writing fellowship, I picked up this subject because I thought and I saw in the existing literature in English as well as in other languages that most of the prominent books which talk about the history of revolutionary nationalism, they take the approach of the positivistic history that Dr. Kakkar has told us about. And in that, the problem is mainly with regard to not covering all aspects of this historical phenomenon. So, for example, the economic and political aspects of this particular phenomenon has been covered very well and by multiple authors. But the cultural and religious impetuses, if I may call them that, are largely missing from the narrative. So, I'm trying to bring into the discourse the religious as well as cultural forces that have shaped this particular phenomenon called the revolutionary nationalism in our country. through this book. And I am also trying to address this question of how we look at history. So, you see, Dr. Kakkar has touched on this in his interventions, that there is this teleological tendency in history. Okay, so because of this linear conception, and also the positivistic focus on objectivity, on finding the hard fact, etc., etc. But the problem is that in Europe itself, from European and largely Western scholars, there have been critiques of this sort of view about history, this perspective on history, positivistic teleological history, where history has been also suggested to be mainly a narrative. Okay, so when it is a narrative, then it is a story, and every story is spoken or told from a particular perspective, and therefore you cannot divorce the teller or the speaker of the story or the tale from the story itself. Keeping this in mind, I think our conception of history, which we are calling itihasa, becomes important, and the performative element of it can be incorporated into this sort of account, because we can include oral histories. We can talk about the memories of the people who have lived through the revolutionary period, and we can also find historical sources, sources of historical information rather, in the songs, in the poetry, and the literary works like the novels, as well as theater. So, taking into account all these different literary and performative sources, we can build a more holistic, a more integral account or narrative about this particular phenomenon, or any phenomenon for that matter. So I'm trying to do that work through this project.
I can't wait for your books to come out and to be really taught across the country. So from what you said, it sounds like history is learned in isolation, but itihasa is actually a much more interdisciplinary exploration. And that's the way to really approach it in our context.
Yeah, I mean, like history. So if we talk about the national spirit, as he was talking about, and how it can be implemented in the history teaching in our schools.
Tell us how.
Yeah. So, I think it's very important to understand that when we say the national spirit of teaching history, then it will not be taught as in isolation, as a subject that only covers a specific region. So, for example, if you want to study, let's say, currently what happens is we study the history of the Chalukyas separately, then we study the history of the Pallava dynasty separately, then we study the history of the Vijayanagar Empire separately. So the student gets the impression that, okay, there were so many different kinds of regions in India which were not maybe connected to each other, and there is no grand narrative that is impressed upon the mind of the student. So as a result, there is no national soul also. There is no national spirit that is developed, because there is no larger framework that is the student is taught. But when you teach the history from a national perspective, then you will show that, for example, if you want to teach about dynasties, most of these dynasties were interconnected. Many of them drew a common ancestry from, the same, let's say, epics in the Mahabharata, Ramayana. Okay. Let's say if you want to teach about the history of from ancient period onwards, then you will look at the swastik symbols from the Harappan time. You will look at the various symbols, whether it is the use of the people tree or the pillars, or so you will look at the continuities across time, and you will look at the commonalities across space. So when you look at the history from this perspective, that is when you are teaching a national perspective of history. So when Sri Aurobindo said national spirit in education, in the discipline of history, this is what it means when you say national history. It is not that you're going to teach that, okay, India was a great nation and, you're only going to glorify the past. No, that's not the point of teaching a national history. This is the problem that, often is alleged against nationalist historians. They say that, okay, so they were nationalists, which means that probably they were just glorifying their nation and they were only parochial. That's why even nationalist word has become pejorative because of this connotation, that it means that you are being, you're only being nationalist in that, pejorative sense. But actually, in the sense that Sri Aurobindo talks about, nationalist means you are giving a national framework to the teaching of history. You're giving them a holistic framework. You're teaching them rather the grand narrative of Indian history, not teaching them about specific episodes, specific events. Because if you only teach about specific episodes or events in isolation, then there is no way the student is going to get a larger nationalist impression. And he's only going to think, okay, India was a collection of so many different entities and so many different invaders who came from time to time, and there is no national consciousness. But if you teach from a national point of view, then the student will understand, no, there was, even despite all these superficial differences, there was an underlying national consciousness, and that has remained the same. So this is how approach should be.
May I quickly add to that? So I think this debate about national education and the national spirit, if we think deeply about it, we will discover that at the root of it, there is also the parallel debate about what is the position of history in, or rather with regard to social sciences and humanities. So I have seen many historians, Indian as well as from foreign countries, they would try to position history as a sort of social science discipline. And I think this is, a legacy of this positivistic, teleological, hard fact approach to history. In opposition to that, if we bring the focus on the human being's feelings, emotions, memories, then immediately we can tie it up with the national spirit that we are trying to define. Because national spirit, well, let's face it, nationalism in the Indian context is something that we would call Deshaprem or Swadesha Prema, and therefore it is love of one's country, which is also, at the basis of nationalisms in other places in the world, maybe English nationalism or French nationalism or German nationalism, whatever it is. So love of one's country is at the root of it, and love is personal and it is a basic human instinct. So therefore, to make space for the human being in this practice of a discipline called history will immediately bring it back to the national context in whichever area of the world you are teaching it or learning. So I think there has to be a recognition of this humanistic element in history, and with that, a forward movement towards creating a national curriculum or framework through which history and other subjects can be taught.
Which is much more holistic, which includes not only economics and geography, but also culture, art, theater, mythology, philosophy. And is full of symbolism, like you said, and values that are inculcated into it. Very quickly, some practical questions about it. So there is, like you mentioned, the communities context. There's the regional, there's the national, and there's also the international. You said we were always aware of what was happening elsewhere. So what would be the balance of this? And then there is the temporal, non-linear, cyclical, but still the chronological aspect, as well as the spatial aspect. So what would the emphasis look like on each of these?
You mean that how should we?
How could the curriculum address this?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, of course, we have to keep in mind all these different things, and we have to maintain a balance between all these things. When we, for example, when we talk about the international outlook and the Western influence, so we don't have to see generally modernity as in opposition to the cultural traditions of India. And I think this is what even the national education leaders like Sri Aurobindo and later on, they were trying to do. They did not oppose everything that was modern or Western. They didn't say that, okay, that we will completely reject everything that is Western or modern. So they were trying to find this balance between how to accommodate modern Western ideas Yet within the framework of the Indian larger cultural framework, okay, they were not saying that. So again, on the one extreme were the people who were uncritically after the English education, even the missionaries, and they were like, they had their own agendas. So then one could become a Christian if one went to a missionary school. On the other extreme, then there were people who were completely rejecting everything that was modern,
Yes.
and then they were like like going back to the
Right.
old ways and
Right. But what they were working towards was really a synthesis
yes.
that
So basically,
kept the national spirit alive.
Yeah.
That was
so when we say we have to maintain a balance, then following in the footsteps of Sri Aubindo's ideas, the approach has to be this balance that we are open to modern ideas, to Western ideas, yet we do not see them in opposition to our cultural framework. In fact, the Indian cultural framework can inform us and can better inform us about how we can approach the Western ideas. So they can enrich the Western thought rather than seeing it as a threat. So this is, I think,
so balance can be
yes,
right.
yes.
Two questions for you, Sreejit Da.
Yes.
One is, you mentioned Ramon Roy, whom you've written about extensively, and also the introduction of the English language from various parties. What would the language of instruction be? Does it have to be one or the other, English or regional languages? And two, you mentioned the importance of the teacher and a new way of teaching. So the content can be written and dissipated, but what about forming the teachers in this new but informed by ancient ways of teaching?
Yes, I think it's an interesting dynamic between the creation of the content and the creation of the teacher. In a way, each develops the other, each shapes the other. But before that, I think there should be a resolution to this question of language. I think in the context of a multi-regional and multicultural India in today's context, it would be prudent to go ahead with the three-language formula. You see, we cannot deny the position of English in a global scenario. Therefore, it goes without saying that an Indian student should acquire the knowledge of English, that he or she should be conversant in English and should have a general idea about the English literature and other disciplines which have been the contributions into those disciplines have come mainly through the vehicle of the English language. But apart from that, I think this national spirit itself will be amiss if we do not regard with utmost importance our education in the particular regional language in which a child is born. So suppose if somebody is born in the region of West Bengal or the historical region of Bengal, then their education should be in Bangla primarily. And at the same time, as they progress through their levels of education, there should be introduction of other languages, English, and also a very strong connection, a very organic connection between the modern Indian languages, any modern Indian language, and the ancient or classical language of Sanskrit should be maintained. And that maintenance can be, introduced at proper levels of education, perhaps in the middle school, with at least some years of Sanskrit, so that the child can build an intuitive idea about how the modern Indian languages are organically deeply connected with, Sanskrit. So this discovery itself will encourage them into more important and deeper discoveries of the source texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and maybe, who knows, the Upanishads and the Vedas as well. I'm speaking from a very personal experience because I was fortunate enough that the West Bengal curriculum had 2 years of Sanskrit, and that was at the 7th and 8th standards. And it was at that level that I discovered the connections that my mother tongue, Bengali, had with Sanskrit, and it still continues with that. So that sort of education gave me the impetus to know more about Indian culture, which I ultimately discovered in the Sanskrit classics, and then going into the scriptures, namely the Gita and Upanishads mainly. So and also there should be an emphasis on translation, between the literatures and other kinds of even technical works that are coming up in various modern Indian languages. I think there is a lack of interest among Indian readers about the various kinds of regional languages and literatures that are flourishing right at this point as we speak. And that can only be set right through a lot of focus on translation. There is some, work going on in this regard through government agencies like the Sahitya Academy, but I would say that's very meager. So there has to be, forums like the Pondy Lit Fest, maybe because it's a literary festival. Therefore, we can have in future editions of the Pondy Lit Fest a special segment about talking about translation of Indian literature and other fields of, knowledge, which is being written and produced in Indian languages, modern Indian languages. So that's just an idea.
You've spelled that out very clearly, and we'll hold on to that suggestion. A word about creating the teacher.
Right. Thanks for reminding me about that. So I think that as the Indian student, picks up the ability to find out these important connections between the present and the past, there will be, a tendency in him or her to find out the source texts, as I was trying to explain. So the Indian teacher who would embody the national spirit would have, would have this ability to articulate the national spirit in their language and also preferably in English, because we have to take it to not just different corners of our country in India, but also to the world. Because as Sri Aurobindo has pointed out, that India exists not for herself, not only for the regeneration of her, ideals, but also for the larger humanity, for the entire world. So therefore, the Indian teacher who embodies this national spirit will have to be very, very articulate and knowledgeable, of course. But at the same time, they have to imbibe, a spirit of seva, of service, which he or she cannot do all by himself or herself. I think the society has to understand that this sort of activity needs a lot of support, financially as well as psychologically. So there has to be a social concerted effort at encouraging and sustaining this sort of teaching. If we can collectively come together in order to create an environment within which such kind of a teacher can operate, only then this sort of activity and this spirit of seva would flourish. So that's the idea of the national spirit in a teacher that I would like to see.
So the future looks promising.
Yeah,
I certainly hope
talking about financial support, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Motwani Jadeja Foundation for generously supporting our work and for giving us a very good, generous fellowship for 1 year to do this work, which we have been able to do now, and also for supporting this Pondy Lit Fest.
Yes.
So
I second
Thank you.
Dr. So I second Dr. Kakkar on this, on particularly this generous support that the Motwani Jadeja Foundation has provided us, all the 7 scholars, for writing a book on history from a national emic perspective, which is something truly amazing. And I really congratulate them for that. And I hope that the foundation continues to support young scholars in this way.
I'd like to end with a verse in Sanskrit, which I think beautifully sums up a lot of the things we discussed, especially 2 things for me. One is that this is not a study of the past, it's something done and dusted, but something that informs, impacts, and even uplifts our present and future.
Absolutely.
And the other is the emphasis on the story and the narrative. It's a verse from the Brihat Bhagavad Amrita. And what you said also about Dharma, Kama, Artha, Moksha. So I'm sure you're familiar with it. Because Dharma, Artha, Karma, Moksha Nam, Upadesha Samanvitam, Purva Vritta, Katha Yukta, Itihasa Prachakshate.
Yes.
And that beautifully sums up a lot of things we've been discussing. And I think more than a definition, it also serves as inspiration
Yes.
for the
As
future.
an ideal.
As an ideal that I hope we will live up to. Thank you so much for
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
been a real delight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.